senator from Utah. Does the senator from Utah have a question?
I do. I do. And at the outset of my question, I'd like to point out that while I disagree with you, Senator Paul, with regard to the specific question of whether or not we should allow Section 215 of the Patriot Act to expire in its entirety, I don't believe we need to do that. I would prefer that we pass the USA Freedom Act as passed by the House of Representatives by an overwhelming margin of 338 to 88 last week. While we disagree on that issue, I absolutely stand with you, Senator Paul, and I believe with the American people on the need for an open, transparent process and debate regarding this issue. And I also stand with you with regard to the belief that bulk metadata collection is wrong, is not something that we can support, not something that the American people feel comfortable with, and that it's incompatible with the spirit, if not the letter, of the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, which we've all sworn an oath to uphold and protect and defend. Let's remember the text of the Fourth Amendment. The text of this amendment, penned in 1789, ratified in 1791, says that the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. These are not idle words. They're not surplusage. They're not there just for ornamental purposes. They're there to put important limitations on the power of government, to make sure that when government goes after things that are important to our personal lives, things that are part of our houses, things that are part of our papers, our personal effects, these things can't just be grasped randomly by government. Government has to have a reason for going after them, and government has to be constrained in some meaningful way, in the way that it goes after them. When the government relies on a warrant, the warrant needs to describe the things or the places to be searched with particularity. The people subject to them need to be identified with some particularity. And you know, these words were meant to be flexible. They were meant to be molded from time to time in different circumstances. They're not absolute in their terminology, and that's one of the reasons why they've endured for well over 2 centuries, and why they've been able to adapt to changes in technology. But there's not any reasonable construction of this language that I think can countenance what the NSA is doing and what we're talking about here, which is the bulk collection of telephone metadata. Now, what's happening is that the NSA is getting these orders from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, and these orders basically tell the telephone service providers, give us all your data, give us all your records, all of them. We don't really care whether they're relevant to an ongoing investigation of a particular person or of a particular terrorism ring or a particular foreign intelligence group of activities. We want all of them. Send all of them to us. We're going to put them all in a database. We're going to search them when we feel like it. Now, I don't dispute the claim made by the NSA that there are a limited number of people who have access to this database. Nor do I dispute, at least for purposes of this discussion, I'm not going to dispute, and I have no basis for refuting, the assertion that the people who work at the NSA are well-intentioned, that they have our national security interests at heart, that they're there to protect us. But even if we don't dispute any of those things, even if we accept all those things as a given, we have to acknowledge the very real risk that the same people who work there now might not be, in fact, we're certain that they won't be, the same people who work there a year from now, or 2 years from now, or 5 or 10 or 15 years from now. And we know something about human nature, which is that humans, when given power, will sometimes abuse that power. Sometimes they will abuse that power to the detriment of others. Sometimes they'll do it for personal financial gain. Sometimes they will do it for political gain. Sometimes they will do it in order to further certain agendas. That's exactly why it's so important to put boundaries around the authority of government. And that, of course, is what the Constitution is. This is our set of boundaries. This is our fence around government authority. It's there for a reason. It's there to make sure that the American people are protected against government. So first, the Founding Fathers put in place this structure that explained how government would work. It established the government. And then it carefully positioned this series of fences around the government to make sure that that power wasn't abused against the people. Now, it's interesting. When the Patriot Act was enacted, and when it was subsequently reauthorized several years later, Congress put in place a relevance requirement. Congress put in place in Section 215 of the Patriot Act a requirement that the business records that were obtained by the NSA pursuant to Section 215 of the Patriot Act had to be relevant to an investigation, relevant to something that they were doing. Now, here again, as with the language of the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution, there's some play in the joints of the term relevance. Something might be relevant in one situation and not another. Whether or not it's relevant is going to depend on a lot of facts and circumstances pertinent to the investigation in question. But it stretches the term relevant, or the concept of relevance, beyond its breaking point, beyond any reasonable definition. If you deem something to be relevant, so long as it might in some future investigation, one that has not yet arisen, become relevant, such that you have to gather every record of every phone call made in America, such that the NSA wants to go after every record of every phone call made by every American going back 5 years, storing that series of records in a single database that can be queried for up to 5 years in advance. Let's just go through this exercise for a minute. Think to yourself, how many people have I called in the last 5 years? How many phone numbers, how many distinct phone numbers have I called in the last 5 years? Well, if somebody has called 1,000 phone numbers, or let's say made phone calls to 500 phone numbers and received phone calls from another group of 500 phone numbers, for a total of 1,000 phone numbers over the last 5 years, then that's 1,000 numbers. And then the NSA goes out one hop beyond that and connects each person, each phone number with whom the original person had contact. Let's assume that each of those phone numbers had in turn had contact with 1,000 phone numbers. You get to a million phone numbers pretty quickly. But each time the NSA collects these data points, each data point taken in isolation might not say much about that person. But as our friend and our colleague from Oregon noted a few minutes ago, it's by using that combination of data points, by aggregating all those data points together, someone can tell an awful lot about a person. In fact, there are researchers who, having used similar metadata and assembled similar sets of metadata in their own databases, have concluded that they can tell what religion a person belongs to, what political party someone belongs to, their degree of religiosity, and their degree of political activity. They can tell what someone's hobbies are. They can tell whether they have children, whether they're married. They can tell how healthy they are, what physical ailments they might suffer from. In many instances, they can tell what medications they're on. And all of these things are made more efficient by virtue of the automation in this system. And so while it's true, people point out that under Section 215 of the Patriot Act, under this particular program, the NSA is not listening to telephone conversations. They're not listening to them. Interestingly enough, This is very often a straw man argument that's thrown out by those who want to make sure that Section 215 of the Patriot Act is reauthorized without any reforms. They claim that those who are opposed to this type of action are out there falsely claiming that the NSA is listening to phone calls under this program. Well, that accusation of falsehood is itself false. That accusation of falsehood is itself a straw man effort. It's a red herring. It's a lie. It's a lie intended to malign and mischaracterize those of us who have genuine, legitimate concerns with this very program. Because the fact is, we don't make that argument. The argument we're making is that the NSA doesn't even need to do that. The NSA can tell all kinds of things about people just by looking at their data. And because it's automated, and because it's within a system that operates with a series of computers, they can tell it very quickly. It's a lot less human resource intensive than it would be if they were having to listen to countless hours of phone conversations. It's a lot more efficient. Now, again, I want to be clear. I have no proof that the NSA is currently abusing this particular program. I'm not aware of any evidence that such abuse is occurring. And I'm willing to assume, for purposes of this discussion, that that's not occurring. That the men and women who work at the NSA and have access to this database have nothing but the best interests of the American people and American national security at heart. But how long will this remain the case? And how safe, how fair is it of us to assume that this will always be the case? We can scarce afford, for the sake of our children and our grandchildren and those who will come after them, we cannot afford to simply assume that this will always be the case. We have to remember what happened a few decades ago when Senator Frank Church and his committee looked into wiretap abuses that had happened within the government. We have to remember the Church report that was released at the end of that investigation. That report concluded that every presidential administration, from FDR through Richard Nixon, had utilized law enforcement and intelligence gathering agencies within the federal government to engage in political espionage. So that technology, which was then only a few decades old, had been abused. It had been abused for a long time. The abuse of this technology had gone, of course, unreported for many decades, but it had nonetheless been occurring. Again, I don't know, I can't prove. I have no evidence that such abuse is going on right now. But I think all of us, in order to be honest with ourselves, would have to acknowledge that there is at least some risk that if it's not occurring now, at some point it will occur in the future. This temptation is simply too strong for most mortals to resist, particularly in an area such as this, where there is, with good reason, very little ability for the outside world to observe what's going on inside that particular government agency. Now, that's exactly why I happen to support what was passed by the House of Representatives last week. What was passed by the House of Representatives last week in the form of the USA Freedom Act was something that would require the NSA, instead of going out to all the telephone companies and saying, send us all your records. We want your calling records, just give us your records. We don't care whether it's relevant to a particular phone call, particular to a specific number that was itself involved in terrorist activity or foreign intelligence surveillance activity. We don't care about that, just send it to us. Far from doing that, what the USA Freedom Act would require is for the government to show that they needed records related to a telephone number that was itself involved in some kind of activity. They wouldn't have the ability to go to all the phone companies and just say, send us everything. They would instead have the power to get a court order to get those records of those phone calls that might well be connected to terrorism based on their contact with a phone number that was related to such activities, or their contact with somebody else with some other phone number that was in turn having some kind of communication with someone involved in those activities. Not all of us agree on this. And Senator Paul, you and I don't agree on this particular bill, but we do agree on the underlying issue. And we also agree that the Senate works best, that the Senate serves the American people well when it lives up to its self-described reputation as being the world's greatest deliberative legislative body. That we would all be better off if we were able to put this bill on the floor right now. If this bill were able to come to the floor and it were subjected to open, honest debate and discussion, that the American people could see that we were debating this, and that you, Senator Paul, and some of our other colleagues who have ideas as to how we could make this legislation better would have the opportunity to introduce, in the form of an amendment, improvements to this legislation. I heard you outline quite articulately just a few hours ago some very thoughtful reforms, some very well thought through amendments, improvements that you would make to this legislation. I think we would all be better off if we took that kind of approach. Now, we've seen in the last few months what can happen. When we came back here in January, we saw that the desks in the Senate chamber had been rearranged. Many of us were pleased by that. We didn't shed a tear at the realignment of the desks. And we've noticed that this realignment of the desks reflected a change in the political attitude among Americans. But more importantly for us, it was the precursor to some very positive developments in the Senate. We saw that within just a few weeks after this shift in power occurred, we had cast more votes on the floor of the United States Senate than we had in the entire previous year. Within a few months, we had cast more votes on the floor of the United States Senate than we had cast in the 2 years previous to that. This was a good sign. It's not just because we're here to cast votes. It's because those votes represent something. They represent the fact that we're actually debating and discussing, and we're allowing each senator to have his or her views heard out. We're putting ourselves on record as to what we believe represents good policy and what does not. I think we'd be in a much better position to address the national security needs of our great country if we had such an opportunity with respect to this legislation, which is one of the reasons why I came to the floor yesterday along with one of our colleagues, the senior senator from Vermont, and asked unanimous consent to bring this bill, the House-passed USA Freedom Act, H.R. 2048. We asked unanimous consent to bring that to the floor and to have open debate and discussion, an open amendment process, with the understanding that we'd turn back to the Trade Promotion Authority bill as soon as we had properly disposed of this legislation, as soon as we had finished debating it, discussing it, voting on amendments. Now, I'm a big believer in free trade. I like free trade. I think free trade is good. I'd like to see us get to both of these pieces of legislation. But importantly, H.R. 2048 is a piece of legislation that has kind of a fuse attached to it. You know, Section 215 of the Patriot Act is set to expire at the end of this month. And many of us believe that we ought to at least have a debate and discussion before that happens, a debate and discussion about what, if anything, would take its place, about whether or not we need something to put in its place, and if so, what that might look like. And so that's why we made this request. This request, which we regarded as a very reasonable one, was unfortunately one that drew an objection, and so we were not able to bring it to the floor. Now, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, based in New York, recently addressed this issue, recently addressed the issue of whether or not Section 215 of the Patriot Act can appropriately be read to authorize the NSA to engage in this bulk metadata collection program. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit answered that question in the negative and concluded that there is no statutory authority for the NSA to collect this type of metadata. It doesn't have the authority. It cannot collect bulk metadata on this basis because, as the Second Circuit concluded, the business records sought under that provision have to be relevant. There has to be some relevance to something they're investigating. And of course, their only relevance here under this program is that they exist, is that they represent phone calls made by someone in the United States, that they were made under a telephone network in the United States. That can't be the answer. That cannot reflect a proper understanding of this concept of relevance that's in Section 215 of the Patriot Act. It can't, and it doesn't. And this court ruling is one of the many reasons why we need to be having this debate and why we shouldn't be willing to simply reauthorize Section 215 of the Patriot Act with the understanding that the NSA will continue operating this program as is if we reauthorize it. It's one of the reasons why I've been so insistent on having this discussion and so unwilling to support even a shorter-term reauthorization of the Patriot Act, is because they're interpreting Section 215 of the Patriot Act beyond its logical breaking point. You know, we have to remember that the Constitution is worth protecting. It's worth protecting even when we can't point to anything bad that's happening right now, even when we can't point to any specific abuse that is occurring. Bulk data collection is itself a type of abuse. There is a type of constitutional injury, even though we can't point to anything secondary from that. We can't point to any horrible secondary effect from it. It is in and of itself wrong. The wrongness of this program can be illustrated when we take to its logical conclusion the very arguments presented by the NSA for this type of activity. Let me explain. So, the metadata that's collected by the NSA right now relates exclusively to telephone calls. The records they collect involve records of who you call, when you call them, who calls you, when they called you, and how long the phone calls at issue lasted. That's it. But if the NSA is correct in its interpretation of Section 215, which it is not, but if it were correct, there is absolutely no reason why the NSA could not also collect a number of other types of metadata. Metadata records, for example, involving your use of your credit card, involving hotel reservations, involving airplane reservations, metadata regarding emails that you've either sent or received, who you've sent them to and who you've received them from, your internet traffic, where you've purchased online, who's purchased something from you online, all kinds of things. From that metadata, they clearly could paint a much more vivid picture of you, a profile built as a mosaic from 1 billion data points. They can tell everything about you from that type of metadata. Now, sure, the NSA is not collecting that type of metadata right now. They're not doing it right now. But if we reauthorize this without limitation, if we reauthorize Section 215 of the Patriot Act and we don't include any kind of restriction on it, there is absolutely no reason why the NSA couldn't conclude tomorrow or next week or a year from now or later that it wants to collect this kind of data as well. Most Americans, I would suspect nearly all Americans, would be shocked and horrified to think that the NSA could and would and might at some point in the future collect that kind of information on where you shop online, your credit card bills, your hotel reservation, things like that, things that could easily be connected back to an individual, easily give rise to abuse, either for partisan political purposes or for some other nefarious purpose. I also want to point out that those who were in favor of this program and those who vigorously defend its constitutionality routinely rely on a decision rendered by the Supreme Court in the late 1970s called Smith versus Maryland. They point out that in Smith versus Maryland, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of some police activity that involved the collection of calling data. The Supreme Court concluded in that case that there was not a sufficiently significant expectation of privacy in records of calls that somebody had made and received, such that the collection of that data would require a search warrant. I'm not altogether certain that Smith v. Maryland was decided correctly, but let's assume for a minute that it was decided correctly and just address the fact that it is a decision that remains on the books. It's precedent that's followed throughout the courts of the United States. That's fine. Let's just accept the fact that it's on the books. But it is very, very different, not just qualitatively different, not just quantitatively different, rather, but also qualitatively different. When you're dealing not with one target of one single criminal investigation, and not just with maybe a few weeks of calling records, but when you're dealing with 5 years of calling records, not on one person, of one target in one criminal investigation by one group of law enforcement officers, but 300 million people stretched out over 5 years. That calling data becomes more significant, moreover, when Americans become more attached to their telephones, when their telephone isn't something that's just plugged into the wall, but something that's carried with them every moment of every day. This, by the way, adds to the potential list of metadata that could be collected, because, of course, many people now have telephones that track their location. And I don't see any reason why, based on the interpretation of Section 215 of the Patriot Act and the interpretation of the Fourth Amendment that the NSA has put forward, I don't see any reason why they couldn't start collecting the location data as well, which would further undermine privacy interests. So, Smith v. Maryland, whether you like it or not, it's precedent. It's precedent that's followed by the courts in America, but it's not the end of the story. It certainly doesn't get you over the hump when it comes to this type of collection. Saying that what was covered by Smith versus Maryland is the same thing as what the NSA is trying to do here is a little bit like comparing a pony ride to a ride to the moon and back. They both involve some form of transportation, but they're worlds apart, drastically different, so much so that they can't really even be compared. Our technology has changed dramatically over the years, so much so that we don't stop and think about it. We might not even recognize it. A few years ago, when my son James was about 10 years old, he came up with a really good idea that he announced to us. He said, I've been thinking about it, and I'm going to invent something. And we said, what's that? And he said, well, I'm going to invent a telephone that is attached to the wall. It will be attached to the wall so it can't be removed. And it'll have a wire that runs into the wall, and that's how the telephone will work. We looked at him and wondered what gave him this idea and what gave him the idea that that was somehow unique. And we said, well, first of all, what makes you think that hasn't already been invented? And secondly, why would you want to do that? And he said, well, I think it's a great idea because it's the only way you wouldn't lose your phone. Only then did we realize what he was saying. Only then did we realize that what he was telling us was that during his lifetime, he had never seen in our home a phone that was attached to the wall. He had seen cell phones, and he had seen cordless landline phones, and he had seen that telephones get lost from time to time. Our technology does change. And as our technology changes, we have to take that into account. Well, our technology has changed now to the point where our government can learn all kinds of personal facts about us through metadata, through the type of metadata involved here. And it's only getting more and more this way every single day as we transact more and more of our day-to-day business over our telephones, and as our telephones become more sophisticated, more portable, and more capable of processing more and more data. You know, the text of the Fourth Amendment that I quoted just a few minutes ago is still very relevant today. And the fact that the Fourth Amendment refers specifically to the right of the people to be secure in their persons, their houses, their papers, and effects, that language is still relevant today, and it should remind us of the fact that our persons, our houses, our papers, and effects, more and more really become a part of this, really become a part of our telephones. Our papers are not always physical papers. More and more, they're not. Increasingly, we're even asked to sign documents that previously would have been physically signed on a hard copy with a stack of papers. Increasingly, you can do business transactions without ever handling physical paper. Increasingly, you can do those things electronically. People often prefer to do it that way. It saves time, it saves money, but as more and more of our lives are played out on these portable digital devices, it becomes more and more important for us to remember that there are Fourth Amendment ramifications whenever government wants to get involved in what we do on those same devices. That's why it's not really fair anymore to simply rely reflexively on Smith versus Maryland to say that this is all constitutional. Nor is it fair to say, well, your phone company already has this record, so there's no reason why the government shouldn't have it. I actually don't even see that comparison. Some people think that this is somehow persuasive. I don't find it persuasive at all. There is a world of difference between allowing a private business with which you have voluntarily chosen to interact to have your business records, particularly when it's a private business that you want to have that information so that that private business can keep track of how much you owe them or how much they owe you. There's a world of difference between a private business entity having those records and the government having those records. You know, the worst thing that private business can do is perhaps send you too many emails that you don't want, asking you for more business, or maybe it can give some of your personal data to somebody else who will in turn make phone calls you don't want to receive or send you emails you don't want to receive. That private business has no ability to put you in prison. That private business has no ability to levy taxes on you. That private business has no ability to make your life a living hell in the same way that your government has the ability to do those things. Not just the ability, but lately, with increasing frequency, the strong and seemingly irresistible inclination. This is not a victimless offense against the spirit and arguably the letter of the Constitution. These kinds of things have real-world ramifications. They ought to be troubling to all of us. And we ought to want to do something about them. And so for these reasons, Senator Paul, I'd ask you, don't you think it would be much better to put this bill on the floor now and allow for an open amendment process, one in which you and each of our other colleagues could have an opportunity to provide input and to try to improve the legislation and to try to do something meaningful with this legislation rather than to just simply ignore it, pretend it didn't exist, sweep it under the rug, and wait until we're up against the cliff, this critical cliff between when the Senate, much to my chagrin and the chagrin of many of our colleagues, is set to adjourn, leading up to the moments when this program is set to expire. Wouldn't we be better off to take this up and to debate this under the light of day, under the view of the American people?
Well, I think the senator